when people see that, things will start to click about what Second Nicaea is really about.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's one of the big areas of misinformation that I'm going to be really fighting to correct over the next couple of years.
Right.
Is like, yeah, what does Second Nicaea really say? You think that it says this, and it's not that it doesn't have anything to say about bowing to portrait images. Of course it does, but that's not really what it grounds everything on, and that's not its
Right.
kind of fundamental claim.
Hi, everyone. This is Seraphim Hamilton, and I'm very happy to have on the channel again Michael Garten. We've had Michael on a number of times for a couple of years, actually, to talk about the history of Christian imagery, the veneration of images, the question of whether that cult of images can be reasonably traced to the pre-Nicene period, especially in relation to the great controversy over this subject, which started with a video by Dr. Gavin Ortland, I think 2 or 3 years ago. And I'm really pleased to have Michael on today to talk about a class that he is going to be offering through St. Athanasius College. It's available to anyone. You don't have to be a student at the college on this subject. So, Michael, welcome back, and tell us a little bit about this class.
Yeah, thanks, Seraphim. I'm really excited to be offering this course as really kind of a companion to my book, Early Icons, that came out in December of 2024 and has made, I would say, quite a splash. It's emboldened a lot of Orthodox Christians about their faith, set the record straight on a number of things that there was a lot of shenanigans about, or at least misinformation. And I think has really challenged a lot of Protestant apologists online to really to reckon with the fact that there is actual evidence and scholarly acknowledgement that there was veneration of images in the pre-Nicene Church. And so this course is going to be a really great it's going to be a really great introduction to the book, and it's going to even develop things that fans of Early Icons have appreciated. It's going to go even more in depth and also give an opportunity to kind of preview what's coming next with book 2 and some other projects that I have as well.
Wonderful. So tell us a little bit about the nature of your approach to this subject. You know, how might it differ? Let's say this is the first time somebody's seeing you on the channel. They haven't read your book. How does your approach relate to other approaches that Orthodox and Catholics have offered to this question?
So I would say that there's some continuity with more older apologetics about this, but there's some brand new things that I bring to the table as well. And so a lot of this involves a careful look at early patristic sources and archaeology. Because the period in contention is the first 325 years of the church. That's the main period in contention. There's the claim that's been put out by Dr. Ortland and other anti-conists that there was no Christian image veneration during that time period, no cultic use of images. And so what I do is attempt to trace references to Christian material culture in the writings of the early fathers, and those that aren't saints, such as Origen, Clement, and Tertullian, but who give attestation to certain things about the early church. Part of the unique flavor of my approach is the emphasis upon really focusing on what the images in question that are being talked about actually are, because it's not as though when you hear Clement talking about signet rings, he's the first person that ever talked about those. It's not like Tertullian is the first person to talk about having a ritual cup with an image of a divine being on the front of it. And so when we see these images pop up in the written record, one of the things that has been, I think, frankly neglected in a lot of ways, at least up until maybe the last 10 or 15 years of scholarship, what's been neglected a lot of times is really looking at the prehistory of these images, trying to understand what they were in the Roman context, in the broader Roman context. Those who are familiar with my work will recognize the phrase intrinsically honorable image. And so I have a dual approach to the written sources. I do think that there is evidence of concrete gestures of veneration being done to various images in the pre-Nicene written record. But the other thing that I add into the mix is I follow in the footsteps of scholars such as Catherine Marzingill and Joss Elsner and Thomas Matthews, who suggest that when you attend to the kinds of images that early Christians had, and they're thinking in particular of panel portrait icons from the 300s, that if you understand what that image was in its Roman context, it's basically inevitable that when that image appears in Christianity, that it was venerated. I apply that same insight. I follow in the footsteps of these scholars, these great scholars, and basically apply that same insight to other things in the written record. Signet images in the case of Clement, images of the cross described as a battle standard in Tertullian, St. Justin, and St. Ignatius. And then, like I mentioned earlier, ritual cups, Eucharistic chalices with an image of Christ on it in Tertullian. And so one of the things that I explore extensively in early icons and that I'll go into in the course is basically some evidence about the use of these images in the Roman context, trying to situate these images and show that they're not disconnected. What the Christians were doing was not completely disconnected from the Roman world. They didn't adopt idols or the practice of sacrificing to images, but there were practices of giving ceremonial honor and recognition, various kinds of gestures, analogously, honestly, to how we treat the American flag. There was that in the Roman world, non-idolatrous veneration. And so when you start to look at Christian texts, you find, hey, those are the kinds of images Christians have. They're deliberately adopting them. And hey, look, there's also even evidence of veneration, of actions being done in these texts. And it all coheres very nicely. Another thing that I add to the mix is a unique approach to the physical evidence, surviving paintings and various artifacts. And I mostly just focused on paintings in the book. I occasionally mentioned a few objects, such as engravings or gems. But I'll be going a little bit more in depth about some of those objects in the course, and as a kind of a preview of what's to come. And basically the argument that I make is that when you take into account considerations of the context of various surviving images, their formal qualities, and then other images, again, in the ancient context that seem to be similar to them and are kind of predecessors to the images that Christians made, which survive to this day. When you take all these considerations into account, it's really hard to just insist that there was no way that it was venerated or unlikely that it's venerated. It starts to look very likely that images of oronts, images of Christ as the Good Shepherd, and an early icon from the 200s of Christ and the Theotokos, it really starts to look like these images were venerated.
So your approach, you're not just combing the literature to find scholars who are supportive of something like our position. You're really you're offering something new. You're contributing something new to the academic discourse on this, you'd say.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things I'm trying to do is to, in a way, formalize the approach of these scholars. So I see them generating certain insights, and I notice a pattern among people. So, for instance, like I mentioned, Joss Elsner, Catherine Marzingill, I would add Robin Jensen into the mix, Thomas Matthews. They all have these insights about portraiture. And then it just raises this question of like, well, why? Like, why do they jump from, hey, Christians in the 300s clearly had portraits of Christ or the saints. Why do they jump so easily from that to the conclusion that these images were venerated? Well, there's an argument going on in the background that I don't really think it has been kind of laid out in a clear manner for people. where basically they're concluding that these images are intrinsically honorable, that there's a culturally set definition for these image types, and that once you see what that is, you can't help but basically infer this was almost certainly venerated. And so really I'm just formalizing what the real professionals are actually doing, basically. And then in the case of the physical images that survive for us, the kinds of arguments that I give about context, formal qualities, and comparanda, those are the same kinds of arguments that you'll see in scholars such as Robin Jensen or Norbert Zimmermann, experts on the catacombs such as Norbert Zimmermann. They have the same kind of reasoning for why certain images they believe were given a devotional use. But they just don't lay it out in the specific formal fashion that I do with these, criteria. And so really I'm just trying to take what I see in those that are better and wiser than me and trying to kind of turn it into something that's more of like a template for trying to see more and more instances of this.
Okay. So the course is structured in 5 parts, 5 modules, like most courses of this type are on St. Athanasius. Let's kind of walk through what students who sign up can expect to find. You start out with looking at the roots of the Christian cult of images in the Bible. Can you just explain your approach to this and the way that it coheres with the totality of what you're saying?
Yeah, the first module on Holy Scripture and holy images in the Scriptures and their veneration. Basically, I look at the holy sign images from the Old Testament, such as the pillar that Jacob set up at Bethel, which, Seraphim, that's one of your ones that you really drew attention to and helped me to see for what it was. The Ark of the Covenant, the temple, and I also want to treat the most challenging instance, which is, of course, the bronze serpent image. And what I want to do is basically to look at what the Scriptures say about these images, whether there are indications that they were venerated. And I do think that you see that. There is talk of bowing to the footstool of God in the Psalms, and that's a reference to the Ark. There's also a very interesting and challenging verse in the New Testament that seems to indicate that the right way to understand how the bronze serpent image was treated by Moses and the children of Israel when it was first made is that it was exalted, and that this is not the same as the idolatrous worship of that image, which occurred later and is the ground for its destruction. There's also some very interesting talk about these kinds of images in both early Christianity and the Council of Second Nicaea. And so I'm going to take a look at the Epistle of Barnabas and what it teaches about the bronze serpent image, which is very fascinating. It's really remarkable what it says. And it's in likely the 1st century, if not the very early 2nd, the Epistle of Barnabas. And then taking a look at Pope Adrian's letter to the Council of Second Nicaea, and how he lays out a very sophisticated justification for the veneration of portrait icons based on the veneration of symbolic images from the Old Testament. It's really exciting to see that and to understand it also, because it does help to clarify that Second Nicaea, it's not just saying stuff about panel portrait images. It has this broader theology of holy images, and it sees the grounding for venerating icons with the face of Christ on them or the face of a saint. It sees the grounding for that in the treatment of things like the Ark and the bronze serpent.
Yeah, that's really interesting because you mentioned Jacob's ladder, or the pillar that Jacob erects as a kind of symbol of the ladder that he sees coming down from heaven. And then you also mentioned the bronze serpent. What strikes me that it's in the Gospel of John, in very close quarters, that both of those objects are alluded to in reference to Christ. So Jesus says to Nathanael that you will see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man, speaking of himself as the fulfillment of that ladder to heaven, which is exemplified in the pillar. And then later he says, as Moses lifted up the Son of Man in the wilderness, so also will as Moses lifted up the bronze serpent in the wilderness, so also will the Son of Man be lifted up. And it's really interesting that you get this in John's Gospel in particular, because John has a very subtle and consistent theme of the significance of the incarnation as the ground for our vision of God in Jesus Christ. You see that in
Yeah.
St. Paul as well. St. Paul, like, the difference between these two covenants is that in the Torah, in the Old Covenant, you would hear the book, and New Covenant, you see the glory of God in the face of Jesus. I've just, this is all fresh in my mind because I just finished drafting a chapter of a book on images, on the biblical theology of iconography, and I really explored this image of the ladder to heaven as a keystone to that whole idea. But I think it is interesting, as you pointed out, that Second Nicaea does have it's not a crudely constructed idea about what constitutes an icon and how that relates to the Old Testament prohibition. It's actually quite a sophisticated and well-developed presentation.
Yep. Yep. And we'll look at that briefly in the course, but I think that when people see that, things will start to click about what Second Nicaea is really about.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's one of the big areas of misinformation that I'm going to be really fighting to correct over the next couple of years.
Right.
Is like, yeah, what does Second Nicaea really say? You think that it says this, and it's not that it doesn't have anything to say about bowing to portrait images. Of course it does, but that's not really what it grounds everything on, and that's not its kind of fundamental claim.
So then you go on. I think the second course, and each of those, just remind us how long will each module be?
2 hours.
2 hours. Okay, so 10 hours total. So the second 2 hour session is about scholarship about early image veneration, and this is really important. Just in relation to the way that this discussion has unfolded over the past couple of years, is that the opening salvo from Dr. Ortland's presentation was a statement about the absolute unanimity of scholarship about the very late development of the Christian cult of images. Could you just help us to see what kind of things you're going to be talking about in this second module?
Yes, I'm going to be definitely talking about how surprised people will be about the actual statements of scholars based compared to the kind of initial impression that was given. It turns out that there are multiple schools of thought on this as opposed to a strict unanimity. And Dave Sims, our mutual friend, has done a lot to kind of awaken me to some of these realities that I was already seeing as I looked at scholarship on, pre-Nicene Christian images. He drew attention to some really strong statements about the 300s and the presence not just of venerated images, but straight up panel portrait icons being venerated, that there's several scholars that acknowledge this. And Dave drew attention to a number of, shall we say, inconsistencies between how the content of these scholars was being presented and certain statements that those scholars made. I'm trying to be very careful with my language here. And so I think that what people will find is that there is a growing movement that is, I would say, correcting both the older Ernst Kitzinger traditional modern view that icon veneration is from like the 500s, and the new revisionist view, that you might call it a sort of postmodern view in a way, of Brubaker and Haldane, that's echoed by Father Richard Price and a couple of others. There's a new movement that really does focus, as Dave has noted, on the images themselves and what follows from the existence of these kinds of images in the pre-Nicene record and in the 300s. And it's by focusing on the actual images and some of the more subtle statements that are made in early Christian writings that these scholars arrive at the conclusion that this question should be reopened and re-examined. And as I mentioned in our interview about my book, I'm really just kind of like taking my cues from them. I'm just sort of taking the next step now of being like, look, you've reopened this question. Here's a proposal. Here is evidence, additional evidence that has not really always been noted or compiled or accounted for. Additional evidence that images were venerated really, really early. So, I do plan to to present and highlight specifically like, zinger quotes, like really strong lightning quotes, basically. Many of which are in early icons, and some of which, though, I didn't have in there because I'm saving them for book 2. So again, there's that preview that you'll get from taking this course.
Gotcha. So you look at the scholarship, a lot of which, folks, is really recent. This is an important point. You can't just go back to the classic treatments of these issues from several decades ago. This is a developing discussion. And then I think in the third part, you dive into what seems to be a really strong prima facie argument for the iconoclastic position. And we don't want to understate that. If you go to any iconoclastic webpage or whatever, they're going to have this list of quotations from the pre-Nicene and then some post-Nicene sources, which ostensibly demonstrate, really beyond reasonable doubt, that the early Christians not only didn't use images, but had a theological rationale for their rejection of any kind of images, and certainly of their veneration. So how do you tackle that argument at the heart of the course?
If you enjoy this content, take a look at the pinned comment. Your patronage is what allows me to continue producing it. I post exclusive articles multiple times per week, and you can get hundreds of pages of exclusive writing by subscribing to my Substack or Tier 1 of my Patreon at only $5 per month. At $10 per month, you get my regular exclusive half-hour videos with over 25 hours already uploaded. At $30 per month, you get all of this, as well as my 30 and counting hour class working through the entire Old Testament story. And at $35, you can get all this, as well as a monthly one-on-one call with me about anything you'd like to talk about. In the pinned comment, you can also purchase my 17-hour lecture set answering Protestantism from the Bible and the additional 6-hour set answering Calvinism from the Bible, either individually or for a discount. Your contributions allow me to regularly produce content, both free and exclusive. Thank you so much.
One of my new refrains on Twitter, it's almost become a catchphrase. I guess X. One of my refrains on X has been that the death of all allegedly aniconic quotes from early Christian authors is just to check translation, check context, and then try and read them consistently with other things that an author says. And then once you do that, they all basically just poof, they vanish, basically. There's a couple of exceptions where there's quotes that are a little bit tougher to deal with, but the quotes that Dr. Ortland went through in his initial video and in some of his subsequent videos, I'll treat a lot of those and basically show that when read in context, or when read in light of other things this author says, or when you look at a more updated and perhaps more accurate translation of some of the words that were in those quotes, that it becomes pretty evident that the case for aniconism in early Christianity is much harder to make than it seems, and that really the fundamental thrust of these allegedly aniconic passages is either a Christian rejection of things like depictions of immorality in art, like sexual lewdness or violence. Number two, a rejection of idolatry, the giving of food offerings or scent offerings to cult statues. And number three, an attack on what you might call naturalism or zoographia, to use the Greek word, in Roman art. So there is a tendency to want to say that art should be an imitation of life, and that art should achieve strict likeness. And Clement and Tertullian and others, they draw attention to how this tendency in Greek and Roman as well art is basically it's a root of deception. And Clement, for instance, talks about the story of Pygmalion, who falls in love with a statue that he made because the likeness is achieved to a woman so perfectly. Clement even then goes on to clarify and identify that in his view, that was actually Aphrodite, that image was of. And so you see all of these things that kind of blend together: the immorality, the idolatry, and this emphasis upon strict naturalistic likeness. That's what the early Christians were targeting. when they made those allegedly aniconic statements. And so I'm going to look at things in Clement, Lactantius, Origen, Minucius Felix, Tertullian. We'll take a brief look at Eusebius and Epiphanius as well. And it'll turn out that many of these allegedly aniconic authors, they actually have image veneration practices themselves, which is an entirely different, really big problem for the aniconic theory.
Wow. So then you go into the written evidence. You categorize the evidence in two different baskets, I suppose. There's written evidence, there's the physical evidence. A lot of folks, in my experience, focus a lot on the physical evidence, on things like Dura Europos and things like that. Tell us first about your approach to the written text. Are you going to focus just on pre-Nicene sources? Are you going to get into anything post-Nicene? What are you going for here?
I think there's some good tie-ins for early Christian authors who kind of span the early and post-Constantinian periods. So like St. Jerome, St. John Chrysostom, St. Basil, they have very interesting things to say about images and, frankly, about the veneration of images, if you know where to look. But it's very interesting then to take statements from these, authors writing in the 300s or early 400s, and to just ask the question, like, well, is it credible that 100 years earlier someone could have said something similar to this, especially if you see the same kinds of images showing up earlier on? St. Jerome has a lot to say about altars and about the veneration of the images of the cherubim, the golden images of the cherubim. He has a lot to say about the veneration of chalices. So when we read that stuff in Tertullian, are we really going to say that there's like no way that chalices were venerated when Tertullian was writing? That seems pretty suspicious. These people are not separated by millennia or half millennia. It's just 100 years or 200 years or 250 years in some cases. And so I think it's going to be interesting to look at stuff in the 300s and then kind of extrapolate backwards. But I do plan on looking mostly at the pre-Nicene sources that I check out in early icons, looking at veneration of the cross in Tertullian, St. Justin, St. Ignatius, veneration of signets in Clement. Going to look at some of the information that we have about Christian signet images from Pompeii as well, because that's something else that needs to be talked about. Is there is evidence that in the first century in Pompeii there were Christians, and that they had holy images of the cross and holy images on signet ring seals. This has to be dealt with.
Yeah,
has to be grappled with. And then in terms of altars, going to look at Origen and the remarkable Megiddo mosaic, which is making such a splash in the United States right now, since it's kind of going to be touring from museum to museum. Going to look at the veneration of chalice images in Tertullian. Going to look at St. Jerome, gold glass images surviving from the catacombs that actually in some cases even address prayers to the depicted saint. And this isn't late 500s, late 600s. This is at latest right after St. Constantine and the Council of Nicaea, and perhaps as early as the early 300s in some cases. And then I'm also going to talk about the veneration of images of angels and the imperial portrait as well. Talk about St. Methodius of Olympus and this remarkable object called the Fastigium of Constantine that gets referenced in the Book of the Pontiffs, which had images of angels made out of silver and an image of Christ, 2 images of Christ, and several images of apostles that was made in the early 300s, probably before or at the latest around the time of the First Council of Nicaea in 325, and was basically maybe the first iconostasis. That's going to be a really cool and interesting one to talk about and to connect to other authors like St. Methodius.
So that really kind of shows out a lot of the interpenetration, you might say, between the written evidence and the physical evidence. I think the physical evidence, it's gotten a lot more press because you're talking about images. You can look at the physical evidence in an image. You mentioned really interestingly some stuff about Pompeii. Could you just what sort of material is most relevant for our discussion when we're talking about this category of physical evidence, and how can you know that a person would venerate an image if you find it in the ground?
So, all right. So with Pompeii, there's a couple of different things that can be pointed to. The scholar Bruce Longenecker is the main kind of point of reference for this. He has been publishing more aggressively on this than other scholars have. There are other scholars out there who agree with him that Christians were in the city of Pompeii, the Roman city of Pompeii, in the first century, before Mount Vesuvius, the volcano, exploded, leveled that or buried that city and the nearby city of Herculaneum. But there are other scholars in addition to him that will draw attention to this evidence. And essentially what we have are, first of all, evidence from graffiti and other things for Christians being present in Pompeii. And then secondly, we have actual surviving images that have the visible form, I'm going to state this as cautiously as I can, that have the visible form of the cross. Basically the tau-shaped cross, where it's just like this, more or less, with a very small, maybe upward poking part for the head at the top. So there's sort of impressions that have been left on walls that have this shape. There are graffiti that seem to depict crosses. There are engravings in the ground that seem to depict crosses. And there's a surviving image that seems to be basically be like kind of a piece of metal that is cross-shaped and seems to not be just some sort of ornamental object or some functional object, but rather seems to be specifically a very intentionally designed and placed object, placed among other images that Romans would have regarded as apotropaic or spiritually protective. And this is a constant theme in Bruce Longenecker's writings, where he basically draws attention to how both written sources as well as kind of connections and associations in physical surviving evidence that we have seems to point towards a consistent view that the cross of Christ is spiritually protective, that this was understood from basically the earliest days of Christianity. Once you start granting that category of an image being apotropaic, it's very hard to resist the kind of inevitable slide towards that image being given a devotional use, towards that image being, in some sense, venerated or used in prayer or looked at during prayer in order to ask God for protection. And so that's basically going to be like the argument. I'm comfortable saying that it's not as conclusive that you can show that the images in Pompeii were venerated. The crosses that were on walls, for instance. That's not necessarily the thrust of what I'm getting at, but can we be fairly confident that they weren't just decorative, commemorative, or didactic? Yes. That's Longenecker's whole stance, is that that's not just what they are. And once you take into account other evidence for veneration of the cross in the earliest days of Christianity, it does become pretty easy to conclude that the images of the cross that we see in Pompeii would likely have been venerated.
Wow. So this is just a taste, because this course is going to be 10 hours, and folks are going to have, they'll be able to ask you questions, there'll be discussion if they choose to attend live. So there's going to be a lot of material here. Who do you think, who should sign up for this class?
Here's how I'd put this. This issue is not going away. This is still a go-to issue. This is an objection that I've encountered outside of, internet world. I've encountered people in real life who have been like, hey, they didn't have icons early on, didn't venerate them, right? And the news about this apologetical point against orthodoxy has spread so widely And I think it's partially because Orthodoxy has this gravity to it and this aura of being the early church. It's very hard when you look at Orthodoxy to be like, they're not the early church. They're just making all this stuff up. Which is why there's so much fixation, I think, on this point. This is the one kind of wedge. Like, hey, we got them on this. Like, there wasn't image veneration early on. So that's one thing that we can say to the Orthodox who appear to be the early church. One thing we can say to them is there was an image veneration early on. And so I think that this isn't going to disappear overnight. This apologetical point that's made against us. Therefore, I encourage anyone who has any interest in this at all, or who has ever encountered, a friend or a family member, or has seen something about this online, anyone who's dealt with this question, I encourage them to join, because it's going to take more than just, me publishing stuff, Craig Truglia's video on the channel Harmony, and other compilations like the one that you're working in. It's going to take more than that to turn the tide on this point. It's going to take kind of like almost a grassroots thing where people really embrace this and make it their own. And frankly, I think they'll come up with arguments of their own that I couldn't have anticipated, and that'll be better than mine, and that'll be awesome. But that's why I would encourage anyone who has run into this at all, take this course and become like really well equipped to basically show that contrary to the appearance that was given in that initial January 2023 video by Dr. Orland, the evidence lies in quite a different direction.
Well, thank you, Michael. I really encourage everyone to sign up for this course. The link is going to be in the pinned comment of this video. Again, it's offered through St. Athanasius College. And remind us the date on which it starts for those who choose to attend live.
Yeah, this is going to be beginning. The first session is July 20.
Okay.
July 20. It's Sundays at 4 p.m. beginning July 20. And recordings will be available afterwards. So if you're not able to make it at that, for those 5 weeks beginning July 20, Sunday, July 20, you will be able to listen to it afterwards. But you wouldn't be able to participate in the Q&A at the end. So the structure of it is basically that it's 60 minutes of me presenting, and then 60 minutes of back and forth engagement between myself and the students, and then that's the advantage to being a part of it as it's getting inaugurated, as it's getting filmed. So yeah,
wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Michael, and we look forward to having you on the channel again soon.
Appreciate it, Seraphim. It's always a pleasure, and thanks.
Likewise.
Are you looking to grow in your faith while earning your degree? At St. Athanasius College, you can complete a bachelor's in leadership and management or theology and church ministry, all taught by Orthodox instructors who share your faith. Our program is designed for working adults. You'll take one course at a time, with the classes in the evenings to fit your schedule. New courses start every 5 weeks, so you can join whenever you're ready. Use the code Hamilton75 to waive your application fee and start completing your bachelor's degree today.